Hey guys, it's Courtney and I'm here with 5 cards with 1 kit, and I'm pretty much just using the stamp set here. And these are going to be super simple cards. These are pretty much solid images and sentiments. So I'm starting off with a stitched rectangle die. This is the largest stitched rectangle die. Die cut that from a piece of Neenah Solar White. And then I also cut a panel of Neenah Solar White. This is 3.5 by 4 3/4. And I am doing a little bit of ink blending here on my cut panel using Bundled Sage Distress Oxide on the top and the bottom. And then I'm taking some cracked pistachio there for the center, just to have a little bit of a difference in color here. And I'll kind of go back and forth, make sure that these colors are well blended. Once that was done, we're going to go ahead and stamp with these same inks, as well as bringing in another color here. This is Lucky Clover. Going to start with my lightest color, the Bundled Sage. Take one of these leaves from the stamp set. I'm just going to stamp a few on the top and the bottom. Now this will be pretty light. It's kind of blend in a little bit with the background, but this one will make it look like these are kind of in the background anyway. Once that was stamped out, I moved on to the next leaf, and I'm going to be stamping this with the cracked pistachio. You'll just want to make sure that you're a little bit careful, being these have pigment ink within them. They do take a little bit of time to dry, so you'll just want to be careful that you don't smear it as you're stamping. Last, I'll take one of these other little leaves, and I'm going to be stamping this with the Lucky Clover, kind of just in between some of these leaves that we already stamped out, as well as each side. This is just to kind of bring in a little bit more of a brighter color. Now, like I said, this is a pigment ink, or a type of pigment ink anyway, and it takes some time to dry. So I wanted to heat emboss my sentiments, but I wanted to make sure that my panel was nice and dry. So I did take my heat tool just to double check to make sure it was, and I sprinkled on some of my embossing powder just in a random area, just to make sure that it wasn't going to stick to any areas that I didn't want it to. Once that was all set, I treated my panel with my anti-static tool, stamped my sentiment with Versamark ink, sprinkled on more of that white embossing powder, and went ahead and heat set that. Next, I took that stitched rectangle die cut and I adhered that with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue to a green card base. And my glue was a little bit clogged up there. You have to make sure that you put the top on right away, and I must not have at one point. So this is double-ended. So I just took the other end and glued that on flat to my card base. Then I popped up my panel there that we did the ink blending and stamping on with some fun foam, and adhered that right over top of that die cut. Now the Tombow Mono Multi Glue does take a little bit of time to dry on foam, so you want to just make sure that you either put this under something heavy or you just hold it down before you move on. Last, I took some clear Nuvo drops just to kind of scatter those throughout, and that is it for card number 1. For my second card, we're going to cheat a little bit here and make it appear as if it's a messy watercolor, but we're going to make this nice and simple. So I am working on a piece of Bristol Smooth cardstock, and I have a variety of different color regular distress inks here. And I'm going to be stamping my little leaves that are within the stamp set. There's a ton of them. And I'm just going to kind of create a background here. Now, normally I wouldn't stamp with regular distress inks just because they don't give a great impression, but in this case, it won't really matter too much. I am using Wild Honey, Barn Door, Rusty Hinge, Vintage Photo, and Aged Mahogany. And like I said, I'm just kind of scattering these throughout. Once my stamping was all done, this paper can take quite a bit of water, and you can do some blending on it. I wouldn't recommend traditional watercoloring on it, but for this technique, it works great. So once all of my leaves were stamped out, I'm going to take a mister here, and I'm just going to lightly spray my card panel here. And I'm just going to let my colors bleed a little bit into one another, bleed outside of the image a little bit. put that aside to dry, and you can definitely use your heat tool. Once this was almost dry, I did end up using my heat tool just because I'm impatient. And I felt like it needed a little bit something extra in the background. So I'm taking one of my acrylic blocks and I'm taking the aged mahogany distress ink that we used for one of those leaves, just smushing that down onto my acrylic block, adding a little bit of water and just splattering that throughout the card base, or card panel rather. And I did like the look of this. It did give it a little bit more of a watercolor feel, but I still felt it needed something. The colors were too similar to one another. So I ended up taking one of the smaller leaves within the stamp set, and I'm stamping with peeled paint, again, regular distress ink, just kind of filling in some of those blank areas. Then I'll add a little bit more water and let that bleed out as well. Once my card panel was completely dry, I went ahead and stamped one of the sentiments from the stamp set with VersaFine ink, then adhered that to an A2 size white card base, and realized again I chose the wrong card base and I chose a top folding and adhered it wrong. So I ripped that up and decided this would probably look better on a craft card base anyway. So I did adhere that flat to a craft card base, and that is it for card number 2. For my third card, we're going to make this a real clean and simple card. I am taking a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and I'm cutting this down with my stitch rectangle die again, but this is going to be the second largest one. Taking a variety of colors of Hero Arts ink and just one of the images within the stamp set. I'm going to start with my middle two just for placement alone. I am using, this is just Rust. Then I'll move on to Pumpkin Pie, I believe this is. And then on the end, I'm going to use the Soft Olive. And then in the beginning, it will be the Red Royal. Now that one with the Pumpkin Pie, you can see that it's maybe has too much ink on the ink pad, and my image kind of bled there. So I'm just going to take a white gel pen and kind of create that gap that that image has. Next, I am going to take one of the sentiments, and these is one of the teeny tiny sentiments from the stamp set. Treat my black cardstock with an anti-static tool, stamp my sentiment with Versamark ink, sprinkle on some white embossing powder, and heat set that. Then I'll trim this down into a teeny tiny strip, and I'm using my smallest paper cutter here. I find that for something this tiny, it's best to use a smaller trimmer. Once I was happy with the size of my little strip there, which I had to kind of play around with a little bit, I'm going to adhere this right directly over my stamped images. First, I did pop up my panel there with some Scotch foam tape onto an A2 size top folding note card, and I wanted my strip to go right across the entire card, not just the card panel itself. So I put a little bit of the Scotch foam tape that I had left over on either side of my sentiment strip, and then I added some Tombow Mono Multi Glue to the middle part of the strip. This will be flat on that raised up panel, and that way it'll go flat across the entire card. And that is it for card number 3. For my fourth card, we're going to be doing a little bit of shadow stamping. I don't even know if that's a real thing, but that's what I'm going to call it. But I am starting off with a panel of the green cardstock that came with the kit. This is cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I'm taking just one of these images from the stamp set, and I'm going to be stamping this all around my edges. That's going to be pretty much the only part that you see. And I'm using Evergreen ink by Simon Says Stamp. And like I said, you're only going to see the outside, but I am filling in any gaps just in case any of these areas peek through once I add my sentiment down. For my sentiment for the middle, I'm going to take a piece of the Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and I'm going to cut this down with the second to smallest die from the Inside Out diagonal rectangle die from MFT. I think that's what you call it. I'll link it below. And I'm going to cut this down with Neenah Solar White, if I didn't already say that. And for my sentiment, I'm going to be using a black ink, and you can use any black ink here. And I'm going to double stamp this, or I'm going to stamp off. And here I'm just kind of testing it out on a scrap piece of paper. I'm going to stamp off on that scrap piece of paper and then stamp it on my sentiment strip there. Next, I'll take that same evergreen ink that we used for the background, and I'm going to kind of place that right directly over where we stamped it and move up and to the right a little bit. So I don't know whether you can see there, but it will make it appear as if those words have a shadow. Then I'll add one of these smaller sentiments that coordinate together just underneath that. No shadow for this one. These are teeny tiny letters, so it won't really make too much of a difference. And I ended up taking the largest die from that same die set from MFT and die cutting the main panel there, or the panel that we did the background on. Adhered this flat to a white A2 size note card, and then popped up my little sentiment there with some Scotch foam tape. I added a few Nuvo drops just around that sentiment, and that is card 4. Now for my final card, I'm going to bring out my Copics. I can't resist. It wouldn't be a Courtney card without bringing in some sort of coloring technique. So I am working on a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock. This is cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And I'm going to be stamping the sentiment that I plan on using onto a piece of Simon Says stamp masking paper, and then cutting that down with my paper trimmer right pretty much along the edges of my words. I don't really want too much of a border here. Then I am going to center this onto my card panel. And this looks a lot easier than it actually is. I had to kind of keep ripping up my mask and repositioning it. And once I was happy with the placement, I left it there. And then I'll do my stamping. And we're going to be doing a little bit of no line coloring, but not really any kind of realistic coloring, I guess you could say. So it's going to kind of look a little bit messy. So I'm going to be stamping with Fade Out ink by Ink on 3. And I didn't really clean my stamps too well. So some of the colors that I had previously used with these stamps kind of showed through, especially the first 1 or 2 times that I stamped them. But that's okay. I'll just kind of use the same color family for my coloring for those particular images. And I'm just going to be stamping all around my card, the outside edges around where my sentiment is. And then we'll move on to the Copic coloring. And I'll only show you just one of each of the images and how I colored them. I wasn't too particular or too careful with my coloring. So I'm going to start off with the greens, and I'm going to go right in with my darkest color, which is not something I normally do. But I'm going to go right over the little stem and then just add 1 or 2 flicks right there where the stem meets the little leaf with my G28. Then I'll go in with my G24 and just kind of blend that out just a little bit. And then finally go in with my G21, and I'm pretty much just outlining the image so that that ink kind of fades away, and blending all of those colors together. I don't, like I said, want to make this look too realistic. I want it to kind of look not muddy, but kind of like a watercolor look, I guess. For this next leaf, I'm pretty much coloring this the same way with just a different color combinations. I guess I kind of had to stick to a dark orange here, being my stamp wasn't clean. So starting with my E18 and just again going over the stem, and then just 1 or 2 flicks where the leaves meet the stem. Then I'll go in with my YR18 and extend those flicks out a little bit further. And then finally going in with my YR68 and just outlining and filling in each one of those leaves. Now for this next leaf here, this one was a little bit more difficult because you have the veins within the leaves and you don't want to lose those, depending on what ink you use. it'll be easier to lose those, especially with the fade out ink, because that's what the ink is made for. So I'm going to go in again with my darkest color, go right over that stem, and I'm going to go over all of these little veins that are in these leaves. Well, it's one leaf, but each section of the leaf, I should say. Then I went in with my mid-tone color and just added a little bit of shading to the base of each of the sections of the leaf, and then blended that out with my lightest color. And I really wasn't getting as much contrast as I was looking for. Like I said, I wasn't looking for a realistic look, but I did want to have some contrast to each of the images. So once I had that lightest color down, and again, I'm pretty much just outlining the image and then filling that area in, I did add a little bit more shading with my darkest color to the base of each of those little sections, blended that out with my mid-tone, and then finally going back to the lightest color again. Now for this fourth leaf, I had no idea how to color this, and I did not do a great job. I'm not that talented. So I'm pretty much using the same technique as I did for that orange one or that yellowish one that we just did. I'm going over the veins with my darkest color here. And for my shading on this one, I was going to put the shading where the leaf is kind of bent in or curved, and that looked absolutely terrible. I tried to blend that out a little bit with my lightest color, and my lightest color is an R83 or 85, and it's more of a pink than a red. So it really was looking pretty terrible. So I ended up going back to my darkest color and adding a little bit of shading to the base of the leaf, blending that out with the mid-tone, and then finally back to the lightest color. I'm glad I only stamped 3 of these, and most of them you can barely see because I did a terrible job on this coloring. Once the coloring was done for all of my leaves, I took Vintage Photo regular distress ink, and I want to basically just create some shadows around where my mask is. This is a new ink blending, not the tool, but the little foam pad that goes on it. So it's not really seasoned. The more ink that you have built up on there, the better blend you're going to get. I was kind of getting streaky lines. I just didn't have enough ink on there. So I ended up lightly with a very light hand, starting on my mask, working my way out to the edge of the panel and pretty much covering up the entire panel, just concentrating the darkest areas of that distress ink being around my mask there. And you can see my mask was coming up a little bit, so I knew I was going to have some bleeding underneath there. So once I removed my mask, I was able to touch that up with a sand eraser. I did go around the edges, old school style, with the Vintage Photo to add a little bit more of a distressed look. Like I said, I did take my sand eraser to get that little area up in the corner. Now, when you use your sand eraser, you want to make sure that you're not pressing too hard. You just want to go over it very lightly, wipe that away as you go, and eventually you'll be able to get at least most of the color off. Next, I took that same sentiment that we had stamped out on the masking paper in the beginning, inked that up with VersaFine ink, and stamped that down, and did not get a good impression at all. Probably should have used my MISTI for this, but I didn't. And now it's too intricate of a sentiment to go over the same area again and be able to line that up. So I took my mask that I had peeled up already, and I'm just using my grid mat there to measure that out. And I'm going to cut another piece of the Neenah Solar White down to that same size that the mask was, because obviously that's the size of the sentiment. And I'm going to restamp my sentiment onto this little piece that we're cutting down here. And I changed my acrylic block. I'm using a larger block and one that is a little bit thinner. I find that for a larger image, if you do plan on using an acrylic block versus a stamp positioner, if you use a thinner block, you're able to apply more pressure, or at least that's what works for me. So I inked that up again with my VersaFine ink and stamped that down, stood up, gave that like a lot of pressure, and I was able to get a good impression this time. So in order to differentiate this between the rest of the card panel, but still I didn't want it stark white, I did go over around the edges with that same Vintage Photo Distress ink just to kind of distress that up, I guess. And then I popped that up with some foam tape right directly over where my mask had originally laid. It was going to be a 1-layer card. It's no longer a 1-layer card. But that is it for the 5th card. So these are all 5 cards that we created today. Thank you guys so much for stopping by and have a great day. Bye.